I'm Dr. Jackie Hinckley with Voices of Hope for Aphasia, and I am here to welcome you to the third webinar in our series of webinars for people with aphasia and their families. The title of this webinar, number 3, is How You Can Contribute to Research. And this is all part of a project called Project Bridge, Building Research Initiatives by Developing Group Effort. This project is funded through the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and we are very happy to be collaborating with the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg on this project. So we're glad you're listening to this webinar, and let's go ahead and get started. At the end of this webinar, you will be able to talk about the roles you can play in research, and also list at least 2 questions you can ask about research. We're going to talk about the first one, the roles you can play in research, now. Remember, way back in the very first webinar, we talked about the scientific method. This is the very traditional approach to doing science that most science and most experiments are based on. So remember that the first step is to ask a question. Next, we have to come up with an educated guess about what we think the answer might be. And then we test whether that's right or not by conducting an experiment. Once the experiment is done, we have to analyze the results. And from that, we can finally make a conclusion. Now, in today's webinar, we're going to talk about how people with aphasia and their caregivers can make a contribution at every single one of these 5 steps, so that you have a better understanding of what you can do to help researchers. The first step in a research project is to ask a question. So researchers have to write a very specific research question with detailed information about what exactly we're talking about, under what circumstance, and how we're going to measure that. Well, what could you, as a person with aphasia or a family member, contribute to that? You can provide input on what research topics or research questions are most important to you. You know, all research takes money and time, and everybody wants that money and time to be spent in the most effective and efficient way. So having everyone's viewpoint and listening to each other helps us come up with perhaps the most useful research directions. The second step is to come up with a hypothesis or an educated guess. And researchers at that point have to start planning out exactly the steps they're going to take to do the research. What can a person with aphasia and a caregiver do to help the researcher at this point? Well, one thing you can do is help the researcher create materials that explain the research in an understandable way. You can give your expert opinion on whether information about the project is easy to understand or not. You might even be able to talk with a researcher about how to measure things. What kind of measures are important to you? Is it important to you as a person with aphasia or family member to count the number of words you're able to say? Or is it more about being able to do things? There's lots of viewpoints that you might have that you could discuss with a researcher and they could take into account as they plan out their project. The third step is to conduct an experiment. And there's a lot of work and many things that researchers need to do in this part of a research project. But one of the things that they need to do is to get approval from a review board that the research that they are going to carry out is safe, that the risks are not too great for the research to be done on humans. Well, people with aphasia and caregivers can contribute to this step as well. For example, you could help make sure that the materials the researcher is using to get people into the study are clear and understandable, that people are going to understand the potential risks of a research study versus the potential benefits. Another thing you can do is help recruit participants. You can let other people that you know about the project, maybe distribute information or leaflets or posters to therapists or doctors who you know. So there might be lots of roles that you could play with a researcher. The fourth step in the research project is when the experiment is done and we have to analyze the data. Now, usually this entails doing statistics and other kinds of analyses, and you might say, I don't know how I can help with that. But there still are things that you can do as a person with aphasia and a caregiver. You could listen to the kinds of results that the researcher got and maybe give a different perspective on what the results say, or ask the researcher questions that might help the researcher think about their results in different ways. The final step in a research study is to make a conclusion. So once the study is done and the conclusion is made, one thing that researchers need to do is write up about the study and publish it so it can be shared with other people. You might say, oh boy, I have aphasia. I don't think I'm going to be helping necessarily with writing up a study. But actually, there are things that you can contribute here as well. For example, you could discuss with the researcher places to publish the information that will be important to people with aphasia. Places where people living with aphasia will hear about the research or be able to know about the research. Should the researcher consider publishing it on a website or in a magazine that people with aphasia and their family members sometimes look at? These would be great suggestions you could make to a researcher. You could also give the researcher feedback if they are writing up an article that's meant for people with aphasia and family members. You can give them feedback on if it's easy to understand, if there are terms in the study or in the paper that are hard to understand and they need to explain more. You can give that kind of feedback. You're the perfect kind of people to give that feedback. So that's another role that you can play. Finally, once one study comes to an end, it's time to think about the next one. And so it might be a great conversation or a great meeting to sit down with the researcher and say, okay, here's a project that we completed. What's the next interesting step to take? What's the next research step that would be important to people with aphasia and their caregivers? So we said that at the end of this webinar, you'd be able to talk about the roles you can play in research, and we just talked about that. And we're going to move on now to talk about questions that you can ask about research. So here are 5 questions that you could ask a researcher. First thing you could say is, help me understand your research. Let them explain it to you in a way that you can follow along. Another question is, how could your research change things? Hopefully, research improves therapy or policies or the kind of care that people with aphasia get, or the kind of understanding aphasia better. So it would be great to ask the researcher what they think their research will affect and what it will accomplish. You can ask a researcher, what could I do to help you? The researcher might have to think a minute, but you know some roles that you can play. We just discussed several different ways that you can contribute, and you can ask them what would help them. Another question is to say, please show me what you're asking me to do. If you're involved in with a researcher and you're not too clear on what it is that they want you to do, just ask them to show you or to give you an example. Finally, you could even say to a researcher, I have an idea. Can I share it with you? Researchers are very busy and sometimes they're in the middle of their own work. But there's no harm in asking to sit down with somebody and have a conversation about any thoughts or priorities that you think would be important for research. Everybody can help, and everybody has a role. Researchers and clinicians have a lot of special knowledge and skills in a different way than you do. But of course, you have special experiences of living with aphasia that is also very important. Researchers and clinicians are trained to do research and understand research. You might not be. And researchers and clinicians, especially the ones who come to our conference in October and maybe many others, want to work with you. They want to hear your opinions and listen to your thoughts. But they may be very busy, so we have to be a little patient with them sometimes. People with aphasia and family members are affected by research. Whether you realize it or not, research is what drives the kind of therapy you get, or policies, insurance practices, all kinds of things. People with aphasia and family members can give their opinions and their viewpoints and can help researchers with tasks like getting people to participate in a study or making information more understandable. Research helps us understand aphasia better. It helps us come up with new therapies and to know which therapies are best for which person. Research could even help us change policies and practices. So research is very important to all of us. We said that this webinar would help you talk about roles that you can play in research and also help you list questions that you can ask about research. If you need to go back and listen to any part of this webinar, please do. You know it's available to you to go back and review parts of or all of it as much as you like. Don't forget that our conference, the Project Bridge Conference, will be in October in Florida, in Clearwater, Florida. And during that conference, people with aphasia and their family members, researchers, and clinicians are going to come together and form research teams. This is going to be an opportunity for you as someone living with aphasia to sit with a researcher, and not for you to be the one who's being studied, but you're going to help think about the study and think about the project and maybe have a role in constructing the research project. You can get all the details on the web pages for the project at the National Aphasia Association. Don't forget to register for the conference, and also if you will be coming, please do go ahead and book your hotel. All the information is there on the National Aphasia Association's website. Finally, we want to let people know about a program called Pakora Ambassador. This is for people who are interested in patient-centered outcomes research, and you want to help your whole community understand about the role of patients and patient partners in making health decisions. If you are interested in that, please know that there is a whole program for you available through Pakora, and you can get it on their website there. You might be interested in coming to our conference in October 1st and getting a feel for what that is like. But this is a program that's always available to you at any time. So we want to thank you for listening to this third and the final one in the series of 3 webinars for people with aphasia and their families. And we are so looking forward to seeing many of you face to face in October in Florida. See you then.